Okay, so hey class, Vaughn here with you again, and for the record, this is in fact a lecture for the online section of Com 270 from Volunteer State College in Gallatin, Tennessee. Posted on my YouTube channel. I'm going to go ahead and let it just be public and all of these lectures for class, just in case there's somebody out there that enjoys this kind of thing and can get something out of it. Cool. We are, in fact, in our book, which is Audio Basics by Stanley Alton. And this particular week, a little bit more than most, I will be just sort of kind of reading through the book and sticking with it. One thing I want to mention to those of you who are, in fact, taking the class for credit is that my book is marked with areas that say, this is a quiz question. And so what I will do is kind of highlight those things and say something to the extent of, this is a quiz question, or maybe you might want to know this. Or something like that. So, kind of look for those sort of key phrases, if you will. Cool? We're talking about, right now we are talking about speakers. We're talking about monitoring in the recording studio. And a lot of this sort of goes over into just monitoring in any environment. And I will also mention, by the way, this is chapter 5. Read along with me, starting on page 47, that in the professional studio world, we call a box like that with some speakers in it, we call that a monitor, a control room monitor. Out in the regular world, regular people will probably call that a speaker. To people like me, the individual components in that thing may be speakers or drivers, but the entire box, a collection, is a monitor. Okay, cool. An audio monitor. So here's what I want to start out with. Beginning of the chapter. Hey, read along. In audio production, no single item in the sound chain is more important than the reference loudspeakers. And no process in evaluating the product is more important than monitoring. The sound chain begins with the microphone, right? We go on to say, this is important. But when it comes right down to it, the quality of every sound evaluated is based on what you hear from a loudspeaker interacting with the room acoustics. And what that means is before you grab for an EQ knob, before you do anything, you have to understand you are making those decisions based on what you're hearing from your loudspeakers, from your control room monitors. Cool? Which means if either because the monitors themselves are inaccurate or the room that you're in is so terribly inaccurate that you can't count on them, then you're probably going to make the wrong decisions. Okay? So think about that. Yeah? Okay, so we're going to talk about the requirements of a monitor loudspeaker. In other words, when you're getting ready to go out and buy a set of control room monitors, what are you really looking for here, right? Two things that basically you evaluate your set of monitors on, more than anything else. And that is what I like to call how wide, in other words, from the, lowest lows to the highest highs, what can it reproduce? And how flat. In other words, within those low to high frequencies, is it nice and uniform, the way you would like it to be? So in other words, it's just true and accurate. Or does it have some little spikes and dips and stuff that make it a little less true and less accurate? I'm going all the way back here to week number 1. And you might remember this little graph that basically says that the lowest frequencies we can hear is about 20 hertz, and along the bottom is this is our frequency axis. The highest frequencies we can hear is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 or 20 kilohertz, right? The quietest things that these ears of ours supposedly can hear is about 0 dB. Again, you'd have to be in a room that's below 0 dB for that to be realized. That would be pretty tough, right? And the loudest things before our ears start going into sort of overload and we might start injuring them is about 120 decibels. So this is the box of everything that these boogers can hear. Now, in a perfect world, we would get a set of speakers that can reproduce all of that. right? From 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz and more. That would have a dynamic range of 120 decibels or more. That is the dynamic range of human hearing, right? From 0 dB to 120 dB, that is 120 decibels of range, what we call dynamic range, right? So in a perfect world, we would get speakers that can produce from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, flat as a pancake, and they can do it all the way down from just like 0 or 1 decibels up to 120 decibels. That particular perfect world doesn't exist. Okay? So let's just take a look at a few kind of speaker curves here that I've got up on my screen. Cool? How about I grab this thing? We'll move her a little bit closer here. Hey, this is some slick camera work, isn't it? Y'all see this graph right here? Okay. Now, this, if you look at this, right, here's 20 hertz down at the bottom, right? There's 20,000 up there at the top. And this thing, by the way, it's from 60 dB to 100 dB. And it's basically showing you how flat this is when you're monitoring here around 88 decibels. Okay? And by the way, 88 decibels, between 80 and 90 decibels is about where the human ear is the flattest. That's where we should be monitoring in the control room. As I told you last time, get an app for your phone to find out how loud you're listening. So this particular speaker here, you'll notice that, from say about 50 hertz here, all the way up to 20,000 hertz, and maybe even above, it's relatively flat within a couple of dB. That's pretty darn accurate. Now you will notice that down here below about 40 or 50 hertz, it starts to drop off pretty significantly. That's pretty typical in studio monitors or in any monitors, because quite honestly, these extremely low frequencies are huge honking waves, and they are going to take, an enormous amount of speaker and power or something to push that much air around, right? So, that means that if this was what you were monitoring through, this would be an awesome, fantastic monitoring system. But to monitor, to show you the effects of what would be in, for instance, a dance club where they've got lots and lots and lots of subwoofers, you probably would want to add a subwoofer to this speaker system so that you could get this very bottom end that is rolled off here. Okay, let's look at another one. Now look at this baby here. Now this sucker here is practically flat as a pancake from just above 20 hertz all the way up, and here it's got a little bump from like 5 to 10K, but man, and look what happens above 10K. It falls off like a son of a gun. That rocks, except for that top end. For those of you who've lost your ability to hear high frequencies, you might not care. The rest of the world might care. This is a trick one. Okay, that's not the trick one. I've got the trick one coming up. This is pretty much the opposite, right? I mean, if you look at this, we have a curve that is relatively flat. This is from -10 to +10, and they're calling this the reference line. Is relatively flat here, above about 200 hertz, although it's a little more than what I'd like. But man, look at this amazing drop-off that starts below 200 hertz, right? This would not be a great monitor in the studio because you can't hear low frequencies at all. Okay, here's the trick one. You ready? This sucker. So check this graph out. I gotta get this up here to where you guys can maybe see this. Okay? Man, this by the way is 200 hertz, and it's already rolled off to practically nothing there, right? I mean, you don't actually get up to fairly normal here until you hit about 1K or 1,000 hertz. And then check this crazy graph out, man. We got a peak here at about 1,000. We got another peak up here at about 2,500, and yet another peak up here at about 7K, and it's all over the place. But have you checked out what this is? This is, in fact, a 6-inch guitar speaker. Okay? And guitar speakers don't require the same type of uniformity. As a matter of fact, sometimes a guitar speaker with an incredibly crazy-looking graph like that is going to sound absolutely brilliant. So, just kind of understand that. But in the world of recording studios and studio monitors, we are really looking for a graph that is pretty darn uniform from as close to 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz as we can get. Enough said about that. So we've talked about it. We want our speakers to go from real low to real high, real or flat, if at all possible. Okay, but here's the deal. Check this out. This is bottom paragraph of page 48. Due to the differences in potential sound response of a medium and its actual response after processing, transmission, and reception, most professional studios will have at least two types of studio monitors. One to provide the wide response and power to reproduce a broad range of sound levels, and another with the response and power that reflect what their average listeners will hear. What does that mean? That means, yeah, it's nice to have, like these JBLs I've got there. The JBLs, by the way, are these guys that I have. You know, those things, there you go. Those things sound great, right? Probably better than what a lot of people out there in the real world are going to be listening at. The Yamahas that you see here with the white cones, those are very much kind of like, if it plays in Peoria, it'll play. If it plays on the NS10s, the Yamaha NS10s, it'll probably play anywhere. They're kind of middle of the road, don't sound great, don't sound terrible speakers that do a really good job of mimicking kind of like your average system in a car, right? Home stereo, that kind of thing. Okay? You'll notice I also have these little itty-bitty, these are realistic brand speakers that have a single 4-inch cone in them. Yes, you can go to Radio Shack and for $19 buy a set of those guys, right? So why do I have those? Oh, and by the way, the television monitor that I've got up here playing Pretty Colors, I also can listen just through the built-in speakers in it, which are 1 inch by 1.5 inches or something, and they sound really bad. So why would I ever want to listen to a system that sounds really bad? If I am mixing for a television show, this is what the book calls, the medium of the end user, right? Then I will want to do the vast amount of my mixing through little itty-bitty speakers, through those little Radio Shack speakers or through the speakers built into the television, because I want it to sound like it's going to sound to real people out there. So if I know this is something that's going to television, right? You're with me on this, right? Okay, let's say, though, that I also know that, hey, these days in television, a lot of people listen through good systems, right? They've went out, they've invested in a nice 5.1 system. Well, that's why I can bump it up to my JBL 5.1 system, complete with a sub and everything, and listen to what it sounds like then. But I need to understand that research tells us that the vast majority of people that are watching, on a television are listening through the television speakers. So I need to do the vast majority of my listening that way, while popping it up to the progressively bigger and better speakers all the way, and kind of find that point where it sounds great through the lowest common denominator speaker, and also works on the best system. Is that a delicate balancing act? Heck yeah. Is it difficult? Yeah. You do the best you can, and the more you practice, the better you'll get at it. Okay? And let's just look at this for a minute. This, by the way, is the chart that is on page 49. It talks about the average AM radio. I'm not quite sure who plays through AM radios, although I listen to AM radio in my car every now and then. It has a frequency response that only goes up to about 5,000 hertz. Okay? So let's just say, for instance, that you are the engineer and you're engineering a talk radio show, like a Rush Limbaugh show, that for the most part is only broadcast on AM radio. You want to make sure that you're listening through a system that doesn't produce much above 5K and that it still sounds good, because most of your listeners are going to be listening that way. You following me? Okay, portable AM FM radio. Now, the bottom end, it says, is going to go from maybe around 100 hertz up to a top end of about 10K. Right? In other words, it's not going to hear the low end or the high end, but it's going to hear what's in the middle. Okay? You're going to want to listen through something about like these little Radio Shack speakers, because that's about the frequency response that they've got. And then it goes on to talk about, like, for instance, a, quote, good quality standard stereo television from about 50 hertz, maybe up to about 15K. It can hear most of the stuff, but not the extreme lows and highs. It talks about, like a good quality small loudspeaker, about 60 hertz up to about 20,000 hertz. That would be my white cone Yamaha NS10s up there, right? I mean, that is like the land of somebody who actually has went out and they've invested in a pretty good quality playback system to listen to their stuff on. Okay? And we love those people. Woohoo! Now check this out. This will blow your mind. The average cell phone, in other words, when I am listening, as I do often, to one of my favorite television programs on my iPhone, I will sit in bed at night and watch a program on my iPhone, especially with my little girl. Bottom frequency response, 300 hertz. Ooh, nothing below that, baby. Okay, that's like no bass at all, right? Top frequency response, 3,000 hertz. Nothing above that. Ooh, now we are in the land of nothing but mid-range. I mean, you're not going to get a lot of lows, actually none whatsoever, and you're not going to get any highs, only upper mid-range. So now you better start listening through really low-quality loudspeakers if you know a lot of people are going to be watching what you do or listening to what you do with the speakers built into their phone. Okay? Keep that stuff in mind. So, I've spent a lot of time on that, right? But now we know. Why do you want to listen through crappy speakers from time to time? Because out in the real world, that's exactly how people might be listening to your stuff. Bottom of page 49. Question. There is a commonly held and seemingly plausible notion that increasing an amplifier's power results in a proportional increase in loudness. For example, people will think that a 100-watt amplifier can play twice as loud as a 50-watt amplifier when, in fact, it's only about 3 dB louder. The 100-watt amplifier is only a little bit louder than the 50-watt amplifier. A large part of that is because that logarithmic nature we've talked about that sound follows. But what does that mean to you, right? What would the added wattage give in the studio? In other words, why would we want to use a relatively big beefy power amp to power our monitor speakers? Because what we get is cleaner and clearer sound, less distorted in loud peaks. Okay? In other words, we can count on our monitors to not start farting out on us and make an ugly distortion. So there you go. Speaking of distortion, here we are getting into the actual specifics, the specifications that you should be reading and thinking about when you're determining if you want to buy a speaker or not. Because man, if you're buying speakers for your first time out there, your first studio, there's stuff out there from like $50 to like $50,000, right? Okay, first thing we want to talk about is distortion. Now, is distortion a bad thing? Heck no. I mean, I'm a guitar player. I love distortion. Distortion adds all these upper harmonics that make the sound complex and cool, right? We love it. I love distortion on a voice sometimes, man. But in your control room monitors, in the speakers that you listen through, yes, distortion is always a bad thing. Because here's the deal. You don't want to hear distortion in your speakers and go, ooh, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going for. Because people out in the real world, unless they're listening through your exact same speakers at the same time with the same distortion level, they're not going to hear it, right? You got me? So, distortion levels, low. You want to go low, 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 right? Good studio monitors, we're usually talking less than 1% distortion at full output. Okay? And the book talks about different types of distortion. Harmonic distortion, intermittent distortion, transient distortion, loudness distortion, right? All distortion in studio monitors is bad. You want to avoid it like the plague. Get the lowest distortion you can for the money you got. The next thing it talks about is the dynamic range of the speakers. In other words, we've talked about the dynamic range of human hearing being from 0 to 120 decibels, which is 120 decibels of dynamic range. Well, you want as much dynamic range out of the speaker as you can. The lowest point that the speaker can reproduce is basically going to be the point where it just fades into hiss, noise, right? And the loudest that it can reproduce before it starts distorting. Okay? And you're really going to be looking for a pretty good speaker is going to have a dynamic range of in that 110, 120 decibel range. pretty much close to everything our ear does. Okay? Sensitivity. Sorry about that. I'm going to read this for you, okay? Is the on-axis, in other words, right in front of the speakers, sound pressure level a loudspeaker produces at a given distance when a certain amount of power is given to it. Here's the specification. 1 meter and 1 watt of power. Okay, 1 meter, by the way, is about 3.3 feet. A yardstick, right? So, in other words, 3 feet right out in front of these speakers with only 1 watt of input power. How many decibels of sound as measured on your dB meter is it going to produce? Right? So here's the deal. This is a big, important number because, I think we talked about, to the human ear, if something is about 10 decibels louder than something else, then we perceive that as twice as loud. Okay? Which means a speaker with a sensitivity of 100 decibels, in other words, it can produce 100 decibels with 1 watt of power, will be perceived as twice as loud as one that can produce 90 decibels on 1 watt. Okay? Even, say, for instance, one that is 95 compared to one that is 100 dB of sensitivity. The 100 dB speaker is going to be perceived as quite a bit louder. And what that means to us is that we can use a smaller power amp to get the same amount of power, or we can take our amp and have it nowhere near pushing hard and possibly getting into distortion. So high sensitivity is a good thing. Next is polar response. In other words, how directional is the speaker? If it's very narrow, that means your sweet spot is going to be very limited, and you'll have to sort of sit in a very focused area. If it's very wide, your stereo imaging might not be very realistic. Okay? So, I want to mention and talk about on page 53, there is a chart that I would love to have you sort of familiarize yourself with. This will help you, right? And that is the chart that basically says from 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz, what frequency range do cymbals occupy? And flutes and violins and girls and guys singing and trumpets and drums and guitars and the bass drum, the bass guitar, right? Kind of get a feel for that. Okay, familiarize yourself with that. Next thing I want to look at is polarity of speakers. We talked about, and this can also be called phase, and it is the same thing as phase, right? Phase is in positive phase, the speaker is pushing out, or it is in fact compressing those air molecules, right? Because we're talking about acoustic SPL, sound pressure level in a room. That's what speakers are making. The same thing my mouth is making, the speakers are making. They are smacking air molecules into air molecules, right? Okay, so in positive polarity, it's pushing. In negative polarity, it's pulling. And the compression and refraction together, compression, refraction, is in fact what my voice is doing. It's what makes sound. Okay? If you reverse that polarity, then, say for instance, I have one speaker that's pushing while the other speaker is pulling. What happens? They begin to cancel each other out. Okay? It's pretty ugly. So, when you're hooking your speakers up, make sure you have the positive and the negative correct, in phase, with the right polarity. Okay? Enough said about that. Monitor placement. Okay, this is a big deal. And this is starting on page 55. And they have this beautiful little picture on page 56 that shows loudspeakers in the middle of the room, next to a wall, in a corner, and in a corner sitting right up against the ceiling. Here's the deal. These are two questions, okay? If the speaker's just out in the middle of the room, then the room itself will color the sound of the speaker the least. Okay? Are you with me that? Now, when you take a speaker and put it up against a wall, up against a surface, then that wall will begin to be basically an acoustic radiator for the whole speaker, and it will increase the low frequency response of that speaker. Okay? Now, if you take a speaker and you put it in a corner, where two walls come together, now both of those walls become acoustic radiators for that speaker, and it will increase the bass response even more. Now, if you put it in a corner and right down on the floor or right up in the corner of a ceiling, now all three of those surfaces reinforce low frequencies, and you will hear a lot more low frequency out of the speakers than what's naturally there. Good enough? So, that means that you have to understand that. If you are in a little room and you decide you're going to put your speakers up in the two corners of the room, right? It's going to be reproducing a lot more low frequencies than what are really there. Some of the cool high-end monitors, like the JBL HLS and whatnot, have little switches on them. Or settings where you can basically say, is this free air out in the middle of the room? Is it up against one wall? Is it in a corner? Or is it against three surfaces? And what it's doing is correcting the frequency response for that placement. So, bass augmented the most with the most surfaces, which it would be, of course, a corner. Okay? Monitoring in stereo. Hey, here's a couple things we want to talk about. And this is right there. Got another nice picture. I'm going to try and find that picture. And there it is. See our guy sitting there? Right? That's a triangle, right? The triangle between him and the two speakers. Right in between the two speakers is something called the phantom center. So, the deal is, in stereo, we often refer to things as being panned in the middle. But you go, hey, wait a minute, there's no speaker in the middle. How can you pan anything to the center? Because with our ears, with the two speakers, with the stereo speakers, in fact, when we pan to the middle, which means both speakers are getting it equal, our ears perceive it as coming from right in between those two speakers. That is the phantom center channel. Okay? A couple other things to talk about. First is the difference between monitoring at a distance and monitoring close. Far field monitoring versus near field monitoring. And in between would be called midfield, by the way. In the old days, a lot of the monitoring in control rooms was done with speakers that are good ways away, 20 or 30 feet away. When you're monitoring at that distance, the acoustics of the room will have a lot to do with what you hear, because the sound has a lot of opportunities to bounce around with other stuff before it gets to you, right? But when you're in a small environment, like my little home studio here, it's much, much, much better to have the speakers close. So close that you can basically reach out and touch them, right? Which is within about 3 to 5 feet of your ears. The reason being that the sound can go straight from the speakers to you without having had a whole bunch of opportunities to go hit other walls and bounce around and whatnot. And what that means is that your acoustics don't have to be nearly as perfect with near-field monitoring as they would if your speakers were out a long ways away. Okay? So near-field monitoring is basically close enough that you can reach out and touch it. And the benefit of having speakers close like that is that the room acoustics will not screw with what you hear nearly as much, right? They'll be negated. Enough said? Hope I'm going fast enough and not too fast. Hey, comments are welcome. Cool? The next thing I want to talk about on page 58. So check this out. Okay, this is my Isosceles Triangle. So right there, ladies and gentlemen, that's a good stereo position. You notice that the distance 1, 2, and 3 are all equal. That rocks. Now check this out. Woohoo! Okay, there are speakers that are just too darn close together. You notice that it's a much larger distance between the listener and the two speakers, right? So here's the deal. When monitoring, you should basically make a nice, what's that called? Equilateral triangle. There you go. That's it. All sides equal. Right? In other words, the distance between you and the speakers, if it's, say, 4 feet, well, then the speakers should be about 4 feet apart. That's a nice stereo spread. If your stereo spread is too narrow, like that one picture I saw, then what's going to end up happening, since out in the real world, very few people are going to listen with their left and right speakers so close together. There will be a few, but we don't want to talk about my mom. Okay. And so, if you're listening with your speakers really close together, then to get the cool stereo spread that you're looking for, you're going to be panning stuff way to one side and way to the other side because you're not really hearing much different because your speakers are so close together. And then when somebody out there in the real world listens to it, it's like the stereo spread is stupid. Sounds like one of those old 60s records, you know, where they pan everything hard left or hard right. And if that's what you're going for, more power to you, but you don't want to get there by accident, right? Okay, on the other hand, if you're listening and your speakers are way far apart, well then chances are you're going to be too conservative on your panning. You're not going to pan stupidly hard to one side or to the other, right? Because you're going to be getting lots of bang for the buck, whereas people out there in the real world that aren't monitoring with their speakers completely off to the sides are going to go, hey, this is boring. There's not much stereo spread here. This sounds, this is a nasty word. Mono. Okay, sorry, I had to say that word. Actually, I love mono, so hey. So that's what I want to say about that. Okay, near field monitoring, equilateral triangle. I think I got that right. And we are just about to the end of this chapter. Few things to talk about. Page 60 talks about monitoring in surround sound. Now, 10 years ago in Nashville, maybe even more than that, when we were mixing records, they always asked us to turn in stereo mixes and surround sound mixes because powers that be were just absolutely sure that by today, it's 2014 as I'm recording this, that by today, everybody would be listening in surround sound. Sad thing is, almost nobody's listening in surround sound, right? Almost everybody's listening off of their phone through earbuds, which is just left and right stereo. There is a big exception, though, and that is, of course, television and movies, where a lot of stuff is still expected to be in surround sound. So understand, in surround sound, you have left and right, like we do, plus you actually do have an honest-to-goodness center channel, and you have left and right in the back. That's the 5, that is the standard 5.1, and the 0.1, if you will, is a subwoofer, okay? So kind of all the stuff we're talking about is there, like, times 3 as far as being aware of that. And the really interesting part is that you do need to, especially when mixing for television, and this requires coffee. Oh, by the way, Woodstock and Snoopy say that sometimes life is pure joy. And when there's coffee in the cup, life is pure joy. Okay, so meanwhile, back at the surround sound camp, when you are mixing for television, you need to do that thing that's almost impossible, which is mix in a way that it sounds great in mono through a little itty-bitty speaker, and it also sounds great in surround sound with big subwoofers and all that stuff. How do you do that? Practice, 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 cross your fingers, and do the best you can. Okay, so now some ideas about getting used to various monitor speakers. Page 62 talks about monitoring in an unfamiliar control room. In other words, say for instance that you have gotten hired to mix a record and you're jazzed about it. It's a great project. You're excited about this. But you're going to be working at a studio you've never worked at before. And maybe it's kind of a different type of studio than you've ever been in before. Much bigger, much smaller, whatever. Go in there and get used to it beforehand, right? If at all possible, bring your own speakers, like a lot of people bring little pair of NS10s or whatever. A lot of studios have them. If not, go in there with some material that you know well, right? Bring some good quality audio to listen to through that system and get to know it. Make notes of what seems different. You might go, holy crap, I'm hearing a lot more bass here than I'm used to or whatever, right? And make note of that stuff so that you can compensate accordingly when you mix in that room. Page 63 mentions the fact that headphones are a part of our listening experience. Headphones, man, just right there it is, right? There's no room interaction whatsoever. It's like clinical. Man, it's sterile. And panning differences from one side to the other are huge. And as more people are listening on their phones through earbuds, more and more people are listening this way than ever before, right? And so what that means is it is a good idea for you when mixing material that you know people are going to listen to with headphones or buds in, to also listen at some point with headphones or buds in, so you can kind of get that idea. You might have to do a little adjustment. Yeah, okay, so now we got to make it sound good from, the like 1/4-inch speaker on here, to the earbuds, to stereo, to surround, to television. Good luck, right? Hey, welcome to, 2014 and beyond. Okie dokie. A couple more things I want to mention. The last thing the book talks about on page 65 is in-ear monitors. And basically, in-ears are beginning to be extremely popular in the live world, where people are kind of doing away with floor monitors for people to hear themselves back, and so they monitor through earbuds. And the really good in-ears are actually pretty awesome. They cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. They take little fittings from your ear to make sure that they fit perfectly. And the cool thing is that they can be used as both ear plugs to block out too much sound and protect your hearing, and at the same time feed you just exactly what you do need in your mix, to be able to perform well. So in a perfect world, they're pretty darn cool. Okay? And the final thing I want to talk about is that, and the book does not mention this, so there we go. But I will, because it's a big thing these days, has been for maybe 5 or 10 years now, and that is the difference between active speakers and passive speakers, and it's simple as pie. Passive speakers, what we've had for 50 or 60 years or whatever. Inside the speaker cabinet there are speakers and a crossover that divides the frequencies to the woofers and tweeters, for instance, right? Or the woofer mid-range and tweeter, if that's the case. But the amplifier that powers it is external. Piece of cake, right? So that's a passive speaker. In an active speaker, that amplifier is inside the speaker cabinet itself, right? So an active speaker you have to plug into wall power, and the amplifier as well as the crossover and the speakers are all in the same box. In theory, this means that the amplifier can be perfectly mated to the speaker and it can sound better. In practice, hey, if you got a system that works for you and you're getting good mixes out there in the real world, well then score. You've done it. Millions and millions and millions of great mixes and great records have been cut on these little white cone Yamaha NS10s up there. Cool. So that's pretty much all I got to say about that. Passive speakers, are they all hype? No. Are they mostly hype? I think so. So, hey, that's it. Be sure to ask questions on the forums for the class, and make sure that you do the required posting on the forum about this topic to count as your weekly class grade. Cool? See ya.